Imagine you haven't eaten anything for 3 days. At last, you discover the fresh footprints of a herd of deer pressed into the damp earth. You've been tracking them since dawn. Every broken branch, every hoofprint in the mud has led you to the same conclusion. The herd is very close. Just a little farther, and your family might finally have food for tonight. Then suddenly, the sky grows dark. A cold wind cuts through the forest, carrying the scent of wet earth just before the first raindrops begin to fall. Within minutes, the rain transforms into a towering wall of water. It crashes against the forest canopy so violently that you can no longer hear anything else. The tracks you spent hours following begin to disappear. The path ahead vanishes. The ground becomes dangerously slippery. The river near your shelter starts to rise. Far beyond the curtain of rain, the predators are leaving the flooded lowlands as well, searching for the exact same thing you are searching for: a dry place. Suddenly, the cave behind you is no longer just a place to rest. It becomes the only barrier standing between life and death. Today, when it rains, we close the windows, brew a hot cup of coffee, wrap ourselves in a warm blanket, and listen to the rainfall like soothing music. Rain slows the world down. It brings a sense of peace. But for most of human history, rain was never peaceful. It erased the tracks of prey. It extinguished the only fire keeping an entire group alive. It turned familiar paths into deadly traps. It flooded caves. And it forced humans and dangerous predators to crowd together into the last remaining patches of dry ground. What we now call a beautiful rainy day was once one of the harshest survival challenges our ancestors ever faced. But here's what makes the story truly extraordinary. Scientists believe that these prolonged periods of rain may have unintentionally changed the course of human evolution itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of humanity's greatest breakthroughs did not emerge during dramatic hunts across vast grasslands. Instead, they were born during the long days when people were trapped inside caves. It was there that stone tools became sharper. The first bone needles were carefully crafted. Red ochre pigments were deliberately ground and mixed. The earliest ropes were twisted from plant fibers. And perhaps most importantly, it was there, beside the glow of a fire, that the first stories in human history were told. One hypothesis proposed by many anthropologists is surprisingly simple. When rain prevented people from moving, it forced them to think. It forced them to observe. It forced them to teach the next generation. And more importantly than anything else, it forced them to create. So what really happened inside those ancient caves when the rain continued for days without stopping? Why was keeping a single fire alive sometimes even more important than finding food? Could those long days, trapped by terrible weather, have been the very moments that accelerated the development of language, art, culture, and human cooperation? In today's video, we will follow the journey of a human who lived around 50,000 years ago, experiencing every hour of what seemed like an ordinary rainstorm. And through that journey, we'll uncover a remarkable truth. Human history was written not only on the days we conquered nature, but also on the days we were forced to stop. Because sometimes, the moments when we could no longer move forward were the very moments when humanity created the ideas that changed civilization forever. Why was rain more terrifying than a lion? If you could travel back roughly 50,000 years and ask a hunter what frightened him the most, the answer probably wouldn't be a lion, a cave bear, or a pack of hyenas. More likely, he would look up at the sky. Because a predator appears only in one place, at one particular moment. But rain? Rain could transform the entire world in just a few hours. Scientists believe the true danger of rain was never the water itself. It was the chain reaction that followed. The moment the sky changed color, every familiar rule of survival began to collapse. The hunt was abandoned. Tracks disappeared. The scent of prey was washed away. The sounds of the forest were swallowed by the pounding rain. Suddenly, every skill a hunter had spent a lifetime mastering seemed to become useless. Archaeological evidence shows that prehistoric humans hunted with far more than strength alone. They were masters of observation. They read every footprint on the ground the way we read the pages of a book. A deep impression could reveal whether an animal had been walking or running. A freshly broken branch could expose the direction of an entire herd. A patch of flattened grass could tell the story of something that had happened only minutes earlier. But when the rain arrived, that entire book was erased. Every trace disappeared beneath flowing water. No information, no clues, no second chances. And that was only the beginning. And that was only the beginning. Current research indicates that the human body loses heat far more rapidly when it becomes wet. The layer of water clinging to the skin continuously draws away body heat, especially when accompanied by cold wind. This means that even if the temperature doesn't fall particularly low, a person who remains soaked for several hours can still slip into dangerous hypothermia. Today, if we get cold, we simply change into dry clothes. But 50,000 years ago, you had no wardrobe, no raincoat, no heater. The only thing capable of keeping you warm was fire. And ironically, that was exactly what the rain was trying to extinguish. Anthropologists suggest that much of our ancestors' lives revolved around keeping a fire burning at all times. Fire was far more than a way to cook food. It provided light after sunset. It dried clothing made from animal hides. It drove away many dangerous predators during the night. It made food easier to digest and released more energy to fuel the ever-growing human brain. In other words, fire didn't just keep the body alive, it kept the earliest foundations of civilization alive. So when the first raindrops began to fall, the real battle was no longer about catching prey. The battle became keeping the fire alive. But even if the fire survived, the danger was far from over. Rain didn't only change human behavior. It changed the behavior of every other animal as well. The deer searched for dry ground. The hyenas searched for dry ground. The leopards searched for dry ground. And humans were running toward those exact same places. What appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary rainstorm unintentionally forced every species to converge on the few remaining pockets of shelter. Cave entrances that had once been quiet suddenly became places where humans and deadly predators could come face to face, united by a single desperate goal: to survive the night. Perhaps that is nature's greatest paradox. When the skies are clear, the world is vast enough for every species to avoid one another. But when the rain refuses to stop, the world suddenly becomes much smaller. And within that cramped space, humans are forced to make decisions that could determine the survival of the entire group. Should they protect the fire at all costs? Or should they risk stepping back into the pouring rain to gather more firewood before everything is swallowed by darkness? It was a choice that nearly every prehistoric human may have faced. And it was through countless decisions that seemed insignificant at the time that the course of human evolution quietly began to change. The most important battle wasn't finding food. It was keeping the fire alive. If you asked most people to name the invention that changed human destiny, they would probably say the wheel, agriculture, or writing. But hundreds of thousands of years before any of those existed, there was something even more important: a fire. Today, we simply flip a switch and an entire room fills with light. We turn a stove knob to cook a meal. We press a button and our homes become warm. We've almost forgotten that for most of our evolutionary history, humanity survived because of a single small fire. Archaeological evidence shows that humans learned to control fire hundreds of thousands of years ago. However, many researchers believe that maintaining an existing fire was probably far more common than being able to create a brand new one whenever they wanted. That is an enormous difference. Keeping a fire alive is one skill. Creating fire from nothing is an entirely different one. Imagine yourself living inside a cave during the rainy season. The fire before you has dwindled to only a few faintly glowing embers. Every gust of wind blowing through the cave entrance makes the flames tremble. Every drop of water falling from the cave ceiling lands with a terrifying hiss. No one speaks. Every pair of eyes remains fixed on the fire, because everyone understands, if it goes out, they won't simply lose warmth. They may lose their chance to survive. Anthropologists believe that many hunter-gatherer communities may have assigned one individual whose sole responsibility was tending the fire. This wasn't a minor task. It was a matter of life and death. That person constantly adjusted the logs, pushed the glowing embers back toward the center, shielded the flames from the wind, removed branches that had become too wet, kept the fire burning at exactly the right intensity. Not so large that it wasted precious fuel, not so small that it died. Every decision demanded experience. But the rain wasn't attacking only the fire. it was also slowly making fuel disappear. Most of the branches scattered across the forest floor had already become soaked. Burning them was almost pointless. Yet current research indicates that prehistoric humans may have understood the forest far better than we often imagine. They knew where to find dry branches hidden beneath dense canopies. They knew how to split waterlogged logs apart to reach the dry heartwood inside. They knew that certain kinds of tree bark contained enough natural resin to ignite even after the surface had become damp. That wasn't luck. It was knowledge accumulated across countless generations. Every rainstorm became a test. The groups that knew how to read the forest kept their fire alive. The groups that didn't may have paid for it with their lives. But perhaps the most fascinating part is that the struggle to preserve fire didn't just help humans survive that particular night. It unintentionally trained an entirely different ability, the ability to plan ahead. You couldn't wait until it started raining before collecting firewood. You had to prepare days in advance. You had to anticipate the weather. You had to stockpile fuel. You had to think about tomorrow while everything was still going well today. That required a very unusual way of thinking, not simply reacting to danger, but preparing for a danger that had not yet arrived. Scientists believe this was one of the defining leaps in human intelligence. Our ancestors' brains didn't merely help them solve the problems directly in front of them. They allowed them to simulate the future, imagine situations that had not yet happened, and act before disaster ever arrived. A rainstorm, therefore, wasn't merely a test of physical strength. It tested foresight. It tested memory. It tested cooperation. And above all, it tested whether an entire community could work together to protect the single most valuable thing they possessed. But after many hours gathered around the fire, when every log had been carefully arranged, when the rain still showed no sign of stopping, and no one could leave the cave, another question slowly emerged. If they couldn't hunt, what would humans do with all that time? The answer to that question may have opened an entirely new chapter in the history of human civilization. Those days when hunting was impossible may have given birth to humanity's first technology. If you were to look inside a prehistoric cave, the first thing you would probably notice wouldn't be the paintings on its walls. It would be the clutter. Thousands of tiny stone flakes scattered across the ground. Pieces of carved bone. Half-shaped wooden shafts. Chunks of red ochre. Charcoal fragments. Layers upon layers of ancient ash accumulated through generations. At first glance, it would all look like nothing more than rubbish. But to archaeologists, it was a workshop. Archaeological evidence suggests that many prehistoric caves were far more than shelters from the rain. They were humanity's very first workshops. Different parts of the cave appear to have been dedicated to different purposes. One area was used for shaping stone tools, another for processing animal hides, another for maintaining the fire, another for resting. This suggests that humans had already begun organizing their living spaces with remarkable intention at a very early stage. What's especially fascinating is that many of these activities required something that hunting rarely provided: time. When you're chasing a herd of deer, you can't spend hours sharpening a stone blade just a few millimeters more. When you're constantly on the move, you also can't patiently drill a tiny hole through a bone needle. But during days of endless rain, you had an entire afternoon, or 3 days, or even an entire week. That was enough time for patience itself to become an evolutionary advantage. Anthropologists propose that these seemingly unproductive periods were actually the moments when humans invested in the future. Their attention shifted away from today's meal toward preparing for hunts that might take place weeks later. One person sharpened several additional spear points. Another repaired an axe handle. Someone stripped bark to collect plant fibers. Someone cleaned freshly dried animal hides. Someone experimented by combining different kinds of stone to discover which produced the sharpest cutting edge. No one knows exactly who first came up with those ideas. But one thing is almost certain. No one invents while running for their life. Every invention requires time to experiment, time to fail, and time to try again. Perhaps that was the strangest gift rain ever gave humanity. It created time. Current research indicates that technological progress rarely emerges during moments of greatest stress. Instead, many major innovations appear when people have enough opportunity to observe, experiment, and learn from failure. That isn't true only for modern humans. It may have been equally true for our ancestors. Imagine a stone toolmaker sitting before a pile of flint. He strikes one piece. It breaks the wrong way. He tries again, a second time, a third, a 10th. Finally, he holds in his hands a blade sharper than anything he has ever created before. The next day, that blade slices meat more efficiently. A week later, everyone in the group begins making the same design. A month later, the technique becomes standard practice. A year later, children are taught from the very beginning how to make an even better version. That is how technology evolves. Not through a single flash of genius, but through thousands of small experiments accumulated across generations. One possible explanation is that rainy days unintentionally created humanity's very first laboratories. There were no glass walls, no modern equipment, only the flickering glow of a fire, hands hardened by years of labor, and a community willing to observe what worked and what didn't. But eventually, the tools had all been repaired. The cords had all been tightly twisted. The animal hides had all been stitched back together. Yet the rain kept falling. No one could leave the cave. There was nothing urgent left to do. For the first time that day, the hands stopped moving. And in that very moment, something even more extraordinary than technology may have begun to emerge. Humans began telling stories. Did rainy days give birth to humanity's first stories? Night falls. Yet the rain still shows no sign of stopping. Beyond the cave entrance, darkness merges with the curtain of rain into a solid wall of black. No one knows what is moving beyond it. Perhaps it's only the wind, perhaps a deer, or perhaps a leopard silently creeping closer. But inside the cave, everyone sits close together. Not because they want to, but because the fire isn't large enough to warm the entire cave. Its flickering light dances across every face, constantly shifting with the movement of the flames. Long shadows leap across the cave walls, transforming lifeless stone into strange and mysterious shapes. A child presses tightly against his mother. The oldest member of the group quietly places another small branch onto the glowing embers. No one falls asleep immediately. No one wants to step outside. And then, someone begins to speak. Perhaps an elder. Perhaps the most experienced hunter. Or simply the best storyteller in the group. At first, he doesn't tell stories about gods. He tells them about the river. He says that during the previous season, when the water reached the great boulder, an entire herd of wild cattle crossed the northern valley. He says that beyond the hill grows a certain fruit that ripens only after heavy rains. He says that if birds begin flying low and ants start moving their nests, the next storm will be even more violent. These weren't stories told merely for entertainment. They were knowledge. Knowledge carefully wrapped inside stories memorable enough that no one would ever forget them. Anthropologists believe this may have been one of the most effective ways to transmit information in societies without writing. A dry list of facts is easily forgotten, but a story filled with characters, emotion, and clear consequences can remain in memory for years. That is why people didn't simply remember to avoid the river after heavy rain. They remembered the story of the hunter who had been swept away by the current. They didn't simply remember which plants were poisonous. They remembered the story of the child who ate the bright red berries and never woke up again. The human brain seems to have been built to remember stories. Current research indicates that when we listen to a story, our brains don't process only language. Regions associated with emotion, imagery, movement, and memory become active as well. In other words, we don't simply hear a story, we experience it. Perhaps our ancestors experienced stories the very same way. Every tale shared beside the fire became a journey that listeners could take without risking their own lives. They learned how to avoid danger, without ever having to face it themselves. That was an extraordinary evolutionary advantage. A single person might live only 30 years, but that person's story could survive for hundreds. And every time it was retold, it helped yet another generation avoid making the very same mistake. One possible explanation is that those long, rain-soaked nights created the perfect environment for this process to unfold. There were no hunts to pursue. Nothing urgent remained except keeping the fire alive. For the first time all day, everyone had enough time to truly listen to one another. And when humans began sharing memories, they also began sharing imagination. One person spoke of a gigantic beast he had seen in childhood. Someone else added new details. A child imagined something even stranger. Generation after generation. A real experience could become a legend. A legend could become part of a culture. Perhaps that was the moment humans truly became different from every other animal on Earth. Not because we were stronger, not because we could run faster, but because we could pass on ideas about things the listener had never witnessed. An idea, a belief, a memory, a dream. And sometimes, a single story was enough to help an entire community survive the next rainy season. But if stories existed only in spoken words, how could they survive after the storyteller was gone? Perhaps that was the moment humans began searching for another way to preserve memory. Not through sound, but through images painted on cave walls. Images that could endure for tens of thousands of years, long after the last fire inside the cave had burned out. Why did humans begin painting on cave walls? Imagine a morning after many days of relentless rain. You step outside the cave. The air is cool. Water still drips from the rocky cliffs. The forest ahead is flooded with sunlight after the storm. You can finally hunt again. But something feels strange. A few members of the group still haven't gone outside. Instead, they walk deeper into the cave. Not toward the light, but toward a place where the darkness is so complete that even at midday, nothing can be seen. Why? It is a question that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. If decoration were the only purpose, why are the most famous prehistoric paintings located hundreds of meters deep inside caves? To reach them, people had to crawl through narrow passages, carry torches or animal fat lamps, travel through absolute darkness, and only then begin painting. That wasn't something everyone would willingly do, nor was it something that could be finished in just a few minutes. Archaeological evidence shows that many of these paintings required extraordinary preparation. Red ochre had to be ground into fine powder. Charcoal had to be carefully selected. Certain minerals were mixed with animal fat or water to create pigments that lasted longer. At many sites, researchers have even discovered traces of small stone lamps fueled by animal fat, proving that the artists needed a steady source of light for many hours. That raises an even bigger question. Why would they devote so much time and energy to something that seemingly brought them no additional food? One possible explanation is that these paintings were never merely art. They were memory. Think about the life of a hunter. He spent thousands of hours observing herds of wild cattle, watching how they moved, watching how the dominant animal reacted when it caught the scent of humans, watching how the entire herd changed direction when the wind shifted. His mind stored countless images like these. Then one day, after rain had trapped the group inside the cave for several days, he picked up a half-burned piece of charcoal, and he began to draw. At first, just a few simple lines, a horn, a leg, the curve of a powerful back. But the more he drew, the more vividly he remembered. A child sitting beside him watched every stroke with complete attention. The child had never joined a great hunt. Yet through those drawings alone, the child began to understand how the animal stood, how it ran, and where a spear should be thrown. Suddenly, the painting was no longer just a painting. It had become a classroom. Scientists believe that prehistoric art may have served as a powerful tool for transmitting knowledge. Instead of relying solely on spoken words, humans began combining images with stories. That made important experiences more vivid, more understandable, and far easier to remember. But perhaps that still wasn't the whole story. Current research indicates that the human brain possesses an extraordinary ability. We can look at a still image and imagine movement. Just a few simple lines are enough for the mind to picture an entire herd of horses galloping across the landscape, a wild bull charging forward, a lion stalking its prey. That means when children looked at those cave walls, they weren't merely seeing colors. They were watching a movie created entirely inside their own imagination. Perhaps that was humanity's very first cinema. But then something even stranger began to happen. Humans no longer painted only what they could see. In many caves, archaeologists have discovered half-human, half-animal creatures, beings that never existed in nature, along with countless geometric symbols repeated across tens of thousands of years. That reveals an extraordinary leap in human thought. People were no longer simply reproducing the world around them. They had begun imagining things beyond reality itself. Perhaps they represented rituals, perhaps mythology, perhaps belief, or perhaps they were the very first evidence that the human brain had learned how to transform ideas into symbols, and that single ability would eventually give birth to everything else: language, religion, money, nations, law, science. All of it began with one remarkably simple ability: the ability to believe together in things that do not physically exist before our eyes. It is astonishing to think that, while the rain continued beating steadily against the cave entrance, while no one knew whether tomorrow's hunt would succeed, inside that darkness, a silent revolution was unfolding. Not a revolution of muscle, but a revolution of imagination. And it was that imagination that ultimately carried humanity farther than any other animal that has ever walked the earth. What happens when the rain finally ends? Then one morning, you wake up and realize that something has changed. The pounding rain against the cave entrance is gone. The steady dripping from the stone ceiling has fallen silent. In its place, an unfamiliar stillness fills the air. You step outside. The air feels colder. The scent of damp earth blankets the forest. The first rays of sunlight break through the remaining clouds, illuminating a landscape freshly washed by days of relentless rain. But the very first thing you notice isn't the trees. It's the ground. Because now, the ground is telling an entirely new story. Anthropologists believe that the first few hours after the rain stopped may have been the most valuable time of all for a prehistoric hunter. While the storm had erased every old trace, the soft mud it left behind recorded every new movement with astonishing clarity. Every footprint became deeper, sharper, more detailed. You could tell not only what animal had passed through, but which direction it had gone. Whether it had been moving quickly or slowly, whether it had been feeding or fleeing. An experienced hunter needed only a few seconds to read information that a modern person would never even notice. A hoofprint pressed slightly deeper at the front meant the animal had been accelerating. A wider than normal distance between footprints suggested it had been chased by something. A tiny footprint beside a larger one could mean the herd was traveling with its young. To us, it's just mud. To them, it was an entire book that nature had just written. Current research indicates that the ability to read tracks was one of the most sophisticated cognitive skills possessed by hunter-gatherers. It demanded an extraordinary combination of memory, reasoning, imagination, and years of accumulated experience. You didn't simply see a footprint. You had to imagine the animal that made it. You had to picture where it was now, what it was doing, where it was heading. In other words, you had to see a story built from something that was no longer physically present. That is also the foundation of imagination. And perhaps, the foundation of science itself. Modern scientists do exactly the same thing. They examine a fragment of bone, a layer of sediment, a fossilized grain of pollen, and from those clues, they reconstruct an entire world that disappeared tens of thousands of years ago. Perhaps the distance between a prehistoric hunter and a modern archaeologist is not nearly as great as we often imagine. Both have learned to read the traces left behind. But rain didn't create only new opportunities for hunting. It reshaped entire ecosystems. Scientists believe that after heavy rainfall, many food sources became far more abundant. Softer soil made roots and tubers easier to dig up. Numerous species of mushrooms emerged after only a few days of sufficient moisture. Insects appeared in enormous numbers. Some fish became trapped inside temporary pools as floodwaters receded. That meant a group patient enough to wait for the rain to end didn't simply return to the same old hunts. They stepped into an entirely different world. A world filled with new opportunities. Perhaps that was the lesson nature quietly taught our ancestors. Nature is never still, and neither should humans be. Communities that carefully observed changes in their environment adapted more successfully. Communities that adjusted their strategies with the changing seasons survived longer. Over time, that ability to adapt became more than just another skill. It became humanity's identity. We are not the fastest species, not the strongest, nor the one with the sharpest claws. What has always made humans different was never physical strength. It was our ability to change ourselves faster than the world around us changed. Perhaps that was the greatest gift rain ever gave us. Not water, not footprints in the mud, but a way of thinking. The belief that behind every hardship lies a new opportunity waiting to be discovered. And it was that mindset that would continue guiding humanity through every journey that followed, from crossing the frozen landscapes of the Ice Age to sailing across vast oceans toward distant continents, all the way to the day we placed our first footsteps on another world beyond Earth. Underscore 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 underscore. Perhaps the greatest thing rain ever created wasn't survival. It was humanity itself. If you could return to that ancient cave one more time, you would notice something truly remarkable. Rain was never really the main character of this story. The main character was always humanity. Because under that very same rain, a herd of deer could only stand and wait. A pack of wolves could only search for shelter. A leopard could only wait for better weather before hunting again. But humans? Humans did something completely different. We turned time spent trapped into time spent preparing. We turned waiting into learning. We turned fear into stories. We turned stories into knowledge. And then we passed that knowledge on to people who had never lived through that very storm. That is something remarkably few species can do. Anthropologists believe that the greatest strength of Homo sapiens has never been physical power. It has always been our ability to accumulate knowledge across generations. An individual may die, but what they have learned does not disappear. It lives on in the collective memory of the community, in improved tools, in stories shared around the fire, and in children who grow up knowing more than their parents did at the same age. That is what biologists call cultural evolution. In nature, most species must wait thousands of generations to change through genetic mutation. Humans do not. We can change through a single conversation. A brilliant idea can spread throughout an entire group overnight. A better tool can be copied by everyone almost immediately. A valuable lesson can save people who have never personally faced that danger. Knowledge becomes a form of inheritance. And perhaps that is humanity's true superpower. Think about our own lives today. When the power goes out, we switch on a flashlight. When it rains, we open an umbrella. When floods approach, we receive satellite warnings. When storms begin forming over the ocean, we often know days in advance. Every one of those modern technologies began with the very same question our ancestors first asked tens of thousands of years ago. How do we survive the next time? The fascinating thing is, that question has never changed. Only our answers have become better. Scientists believe that the ability to anticipate the future is one of the defining characteristics that allowed humanity to dominate the planet. We don't merely react to the present. We prepare for events that haven't happened yet. We build homes before winter arrives. We store food before harvests fail. We develop medicine before epidemics spread. And today, we are even planning to live on worlds millions of kilometers away from Earth. All of it begins with the same mindset: prepare in advance. Perhaps the hunter sitting beside that fire 50,000 years ago could never have imagined that one day his descendants would travel into space. But if you look more closely, he and we are not so different after all. He worried about his family. He struggled to protect the fire. He taught his children everything he knew. He hoped tomorrow would be better than today. The distance between us and him is measured not only by 50,000 years of history, it is bridged by millions of stories, billions of conversations, and countless ideas passed from one person to another across generation after generation. So the next time you sit safely indoors, listening to raindrops tapping gently against your window, thinking it's nothing more than an ordinary rainy day, remember that this very sound once forced our ancestors to make the most important decisions of their lives. That very sound may have given birth to the first tools, the first paintings, the first stories, and perhaps those seemingly ordinary rainstorms helped create a species capable of transforming hardship into creativity, experience into knowledge, and every generation into a launching pad for the next. This isn't just the story of rain. It's the story of why we are still here. And it is a reminder that throughout humanity's hundreds of thousands of years of history, our greatest leaps forward have not always begun with victory. Sometimes, they began on a day when people could do nothing but sit together, watch a flickering fire, listen to the falling rain, and think about tomorrow. If this video has made you see rainy days in a completely different way, let us know in the comments. In your opinion, what was the greatest invention that rainy days unintentionally gave humanity? Was it fire? Tools? Art? Or was it the stories that carried knowledge across thousands of generations? Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy documentary storytelling about history, archaeology, and the incredible journey of human evolution. And if you think rain was frightening enough for our ancestors, in the next video, we'll explore an even harsher challenge. What happened when ancient humans had to survive for months during the freezing winters of the Ice Age? No modern clothing, no permanent homes, no agriculture. So what allowed them to endure cold that could kill a person in just a few hours? The answer may completely change the way you think about humanity's extraordinary ability to adapt. Thank you for joining us on this journey back through tens of thousands of years of history. And remember, every tool we hold in our hands, every story we tell, every idea we share, is part of the same flame our ancestors protected for hundreds of thousands of years. We'll see you in the next video.